I'm sure you are all aware by now that I only have 15 minutes by which to get all of my thoughts across before I transition to another video, so I got cut off. At any rate, we were talking about reasoning and how it's the process of moving from evidence to conclusion. And so you have a claim, if you will. You make a claim with your thesis statement. That's your argument, not so much a hypothesis in a scientific way where you present a hypothesis as a question. You're making an assertive thesis statement that you are asserting or claiming to be true and the basis of your writing. And when we talk about reasoning, critical thinking and reasoning, we're talking about the process of moving from your evidence to conclusion. So what's the point you're getting across? How does it matter? Why does it matter? And how are you supporting that claim? What evidence are you using to support that claim to come to a general conclusion? Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide here. When people refer to reasoning or logic, they tend to think of a process with two steps. It's a general process of reasoning. If this, then that. If this is assumed to be true, then that can be an implication or a result. It's a very simple idea, but it does explain reasoning quite well. If we look at this particular model, we can then assume that two aspects that's a primary focus of making an argument are the elements of premises and the movement from the premise to the conclusion. When we talk about premises, if you will, these are those if statements. That's the if this. These are the assumptions, if you will. If this is assumed to be true, if this is assumed to be maintained as fact, then we move to the movement. So that's from the premise to the conclusion, where we provide our evidence, we provide our support, and then ask ourselves, is it valid? Does it follow logical rules and mental processes, etc.? Is it credible? And we'll learn ways to dissect that. But this is the general format. We look at premises. When we make an argument, we are making an assumption and a claim and then supporting it with that evidence to move through the reasoning process to get from evidence to a certain conclusion. And I want to re-emphasize that we are repurposing information. We're not regurgitating it. We're taking data, sources, information that already exists, and we're always going to create an innovative new idea, looking at it from a different perspective or theoretical lens, transforming it into something that has not already been done. I've mentioned assumption twice, so I'm going to go ahead and define assumption. Assumption is part of the foundation of an argument, as the author expects the audience to share a particular belief or attitude, frequently implied, a point the author doesn't even try to prove, considered to be true by the author. And so an assumption is basic information that is assumed at a baseline level to be true, so much so that it does not have to be supported. It's a starting point, if you will, for an argument. I'll show you an example here momentarily. Actually, let's do it now. The next bullet point. We all want that perfect summer tan. This is a very informal type of assumption, right? Because clearly it's got personal information in there. It's got a personal pronoun, a personal opinion, or a bias. And this is what's dangerous about assumptions, because when you write objectively, you have to carefully assess whether or not you are making assumptions that lean on a certain bias you have. Are you too closely associated with a topic? Are you too emotionally invested with a topic? You might have to take yourself out of it a little bit more in terms of the pre-writing phase, pull yourself out of it, your attitudes, beliefs, and come at the topic in a more objective way, right? But anyway, this is a very informal type of assumption. We all want that perfect summer tan. And we all know that there are, see, I just made an assumption there saying, assuming that everyone that's listening to this knows that that is an incorrect assumption, and I can't make that assumption. But I will say, from an academic standpoint, that this is an informal, problematic assumption. We can't say or assume as a basic starting point for an argument that everyone wants a perfect summer tan. From our subjective experience as Americans, we tend to think that tanning is a luxury, if you will. Tanning is a status, a symbol of status. Those that are sun-kissed or super sun-tanned, lean, thin, all of those types of physical attributes. We think of that as very attractive. We think of that as a higher level status in society, even if it's a physical attribute. But we can't make that assumption because, for instance, think about Far East Asian cultures, if you will, in cultures such as China, Korea, in those areas of the world geographically, a tan is seen as a status symbol also, but in quite the opposite manner. It's seen as a symbol of poverty. Because you work in the fields all day, you're more tan or sun-kissed, and so it's a more of a demeaning social status or social strata type of attribute. And so we have to be careful when we make assumptions, but the main idea is that we are taking a certain attitude or belief and assuming that it's a baseline. It's assumed to be true so that we can introduce our argument, provide a claim, and then provide our evidence and support for that claim. Let's go on to the next slide here. So these are just definitions for ideas I've already somewhat discussed. Premise is the assumption on which the argument depends. You make a premise, it's an assumption. A premise and an assumption are different, but they can be seen as synonymous in terms of their function. When you make an argument, you are going to have premises and assumptions that are the starting points or basic beliefs on which you are going to build your claim and provide your evidence and support to move to your conclusion and make some sort of logical, evidence-based conclusion through reasoning. And what we need to really focus on here with this is thinking about how our assumptions are going to affect certain audience members or segmented audiences and populations. When you did your in-class writing, pre-writing worksheet for the first essay, the top 3 questions I ask are: who is the audience, what is the purpose, and what is the context? Anytime you write anything academic, anytime you are making an argument, you always have to know those 3 pillars. Those are the 3 utmost hardline non-negotiables. You have to know those things inside and out in order to make a credible argument and to write a effective academic piece of writing, because an academic piece of writing is, in effect, making an argument. And so when we make assumptions or when we assume that things are true before we make claims, we have to know our audience and make sure that our audience is going to share those same assumptions somewhat. We can't make outlandish assumptions and assume that our audience is going to accept that as fact or true, because what does that do? It immediately diminishes your credibility, and your logic will follow. We'll talk about that when we talk about the 3 appeals of ethos, pathos, and logos. But the thing is, you have to know your audience, and you have to be able to break your audience down and ask yourself, what are the attributes of my audience? What are the demographics and the psychographics? We'll talk about that later. So what's the race? What's the ethnicity? What's the gender? What's the socioeconomic status? What's the political affiliation? And then you have to analyze that with your audience. What do these mean? Because that's going to translate into the word choices you use, the types of assumptions you make in your arguments. It's very critical and analytical. Just like you would break down an idea or a prompt for a paper, you would break down your audience into its own segments to discover what aspects of your audience is similar and different, that would make your audience think a certain way about an argument you're making or a point you're going to be providing. Again, premise is an assumption on which the argument depends. Here's an example. This is a classical example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Remember, if this, then that. So our premise here would be what? I heard every single one of you. All men are mortal. So you can say, if all men are mortal, then, and if Socrates is a man, then therefore Socrates is mortal. So this is your classical definition of an if-then. to be able to identify a premise and then also the reasoning behind it. If this, then that. There are two general types of assumptions. The first is factual, so based on dealing with factual statements that can be measured or observed directly. The other type of assumption is analytical, or based on facts, but they go a step further because they make a statement about those facts. They interpret, analyze them, or present them in a different way or through a different lens. We'll look at two different examples of that here shortly. Assumptions are usually stated much like thesis statements, either explicitly or implicitly. So explicitly being stated outright or directly, or implicit means they're implied or indirectly stated, and the reader has to rely on context clues and sentences and evidence provided in order to draw that conclusion for themselves. I always say, much like with thesis statements, always try to make your ideas explicit for now. When you get to a higher level, you can work with those implied or indirectly stated ideas in terms of assumptions. I would say that's a good starting point for graduate level academic research. But at the undergraduate level, it's always more important to explicitly express your ideas in an assertive way. Let's look at some examples of this. So a factual assumption here, this is taken from a certain source. It says the stranded people after Hurricane Katrina were poor, Black, and disproportionately elderly. Author, page number. This is something we're going to discuss. In APA format, when you make an in-text citation, you will see there usually is author's last name, comma, page number. And it usually comes after sentence. It is a direct quote. And you'll also notice in brackets here, people after Hurricane Katrina. This is when you insert brackets into a quote, you are manipulating that quote from the original source in some way. I don't want to confuse you all too much. I just wanted to point that out because I know people are seeing those brackets and probably asking, what is that? It just means that you're taking the original quote and you're clarifying it in some way, meaning that you're deviating from the verbatim nature of that quote and trying to clarify it for it to fit in your piece of writing. So the stranded people after Hurricane Katrina were poor, Black, and disproportionately elderly. This particular assumption, if it were the basis of an argument, if you will, whatever that may be, working towards a conclusion, is data-driven. It can be supported. The facts can be proven with credible, reliable data from multiple sources, multiple credible sources. And so it's factual. You can't really argue with factual assumptions too much because they're pretty direct. They're pretty much yes or no statements because the data will provide that confirmation or conclusion for us. When we look at more advanced types of assumptions, those are analytical. Here's an example. Larger systematic problems, such as the exclusion of voices and perspectives of racial minorities and working class populations from environmental policymaking, caused environmental racism. So this in itself could be a thesis, right? A premise, an assumption. They overlap to a certain extent. When you make a thesis, you're making a claim, but you're also embedding an assumption in a certain way. We have to have a starting point for every argument. And this is that. But it's not just factual. It's taking the information and repurposing it and trying to look at a certain idea through a different lens or perspective, making a different argument, if you will, out of that idea. Something that's multifaceted, complex, something that people would clearly disagree with or agree with in some kind of way. And so it's going beyond factual. It's interpreting those facts to lead to a certain conclusion, a certain effect, a certain impact or implication. And so these are the two types of assumptions. And more times than none, when we are writing academically, we lean towards analytical assumptions. When we pick thesis statements, and when we write or draft thesis statements, when we outline papers that are academic or complex topics, it's not going to be factual because we need to make debatable claims. We need to assert things as fact that someone can disagree with, where you're trying to make innovative ideas come to the surface, right? And so that's what's important about the assumptions.